For more than 3 centuries, the Ottoman Empire marched westward like an unstoppable force. Kingdom after kingdom fell, armies broke, crowns shattered. Europe trembled every time Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon. But then, there came one battlefield, one moment, one clash of steel and faith where the Ottoman advance was finally stopped forever. This was not just another war. This was the battle that ended Ottoman expansion in Europe. Before we dive into this turning point of history, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this, where empires rise, clash, and collapse, are exactly what we uncover here. Now let's go back to the moment when Europe stood on the edge of conquest, and the Ottomans believed nothing could stop them. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer just a regional power. It was one of the most feared military machines the world had ever seen. From the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had expanded relentlessly into southeast and central Europe, crushing medieval armies that still relied on outdated tactics. Their disciplined Janissaries, powerful artillery, and centralized command structure gave them a terrifying advantage. Hungary had fallen, Serbia had been absorbed. Much of the Balkans was firmly under Ottoman control. To many European rulers, Ottoman expansion felt less like a series of wars and more like an unstoppable historical destiny. Generation after generation grew up believing that sooner or later the crescent would replace the cross across Europe's heartland. The Ottomans did not see Europe as a distant dream. They saw it as the natural continuation of their empire. Vienna, the gateway to Central Europe, had already been besieged once in 1529. Though that siege failed, it proved something crucial: Europe was vulnerable. The Habsburg defenses were strong, but not invincible. Over the next century, Ottoman armies refined their logistics, learned from past mistakes, and waited patiently. Unlike impulsive European coalitions that often collapsed due to internal rivalry, the Ottoman state could plan across decades. Expansion was not just ambition, it was policy. Inside the empire, however, cracks were beginning to form. The Ottoman system, once innovative and flexible, had started to stagnate. Janissaries resisted reform, provincial governors grew corrupt, court politics in Istanbul became increasingly toxic, with power struggles weakening central authority. Yet from the outside, none of this mattered. The empire could still raise massive armies, it could still field artillery that shattered city walls, and most importantly, it still believed in its historical mission to dominate Europe. Europe, on the other hand, was deeply divided. Catholic and Protestant powers distrusted each other more than they feared the Ottomans. France often sided against the Habsburgs, even when Ottoman armies threatened Christian lands. Poland, Austria, the German states, all had their own agendas. This disunity had saved the Ottomans time and again. Every failed European coalition convinced Ottoman leaders that Europe would never unite strongly enough to stop them. That belief reached its peak in 1683, when the Ottomans launched their most ambitious campaign yet, the Second Siege of Vienna. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha believed this would be the final blow. Vienna would fall, the Habsburgs would break, Central Europe would lie open. But what happened instead shocked the world. A desperate, last-minute coalition led by the Polish king Jan III Sobieski smashed the Ottoman army outside Vienna. It was a humiliating defeat, but more importantly, it marked a psychological shift. For the first time in generations, Europe realized something profound. The Ottomans could be beaten. Vienna did not immediately end Ottoman expansion, but it ignited something far more dangerous for the empire: a unified response. In 1684, the Holy League was formed, bringing together Austria, Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and later Russia. This was not a temporary alliance born of panic. It was a long-term commitment to push the Ottomans back. War after war followed. Cities once thought permanently Ottoman were retaken. Fortresses fell. Supply lines stretched thin. The myth of Ottoman invincibility began to crumble. For the Ottomans, these defeats were alarming but not yet catastrophic. They had suffered setbacks before and recovered. What they did not realize was that Europe itself was changing. Western armies were modernizing rapidly. Command structures improved. Infantry tactics evolved. Firearms became more reliable and deadly. Meanwhile, Ottoman military reform lagged behind, trapped by tradition and internal resistance. The empire still fought bravely, but bravery alone could no longer overcome structural weakness. By the 1690s, the war reached a critical phase. The Ottomans gathered one last massive army, determined to reclaim lost ground and reassert dominance. This would not be a defensive battle. This would be a statement, a declaration that the empire was still strong enough to dictate Europe's future. Opposing them stood the Habsburg forces, now hardened by years of warfare, and led by experienced commanders who understood Ottoman tactics better than ever before. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide more than territory. It would decide whether Ottoman expansion in Europe still had a future, or whether it had reached its irreversible end. As the two sides moved toward each other, the battlefield that would decide the fate of empires began to take shape. The Ottomans advanced with confidence rooted in centuries of victory, but beneath that confidence lay desperation. This was no longer a campaign of conquest, it was a fight to preserve prestige, authority, and the belief that the empire's destiny was divinely protected. The European coalition, meanwhile, fought with something the Ottomans had not faced before: unity fueled by survival rather than rivalry. Every soldier on that field understood what was at stake. If the Ottomans won, Europe would remain under permanent threat. If the Ottomans lost, their advance might never recover. The European coalition, however, was fighting with a clarity of purpose the Ottomans had not anticipated. These armies were no longer fragmented feudal forces. They were professional, disciplined, and increasingly coordinated. Commanders had studied Ottoman tactics for years: how they deployed janissaries, how they relied on artillery, how their cavalry maneuvered. This was not a desperate defense, it was a calculated counteroffensive. The Ottomans had always relied on psychological dominance, the belief that their enemies would eventually break. On this field, that belief would be tested to its limits. The battle unfolded with brutal intensity. Ottoman artillery opened fire first, shaking the ground and filling the air with smoke. Janissaries advanced with discipline born from generations of warfare, confident that once their lines closed, European resistance would crumble. But this time, the response was different. European infantry held formation. Musket volleys were timed with deadly precision. Cavalry charges were coordinated, rather than reckless. The Ottomans found themselves facing an enemy that could absorb punishment and strike back with equal force. As hours passed, the battlefield turned into chaos. Smoke obscured vision. Orders were misunderstood. Units became isolated. Yet within this confusion, one truth became clear: the Ottomans were no longer dictating the flow of battle. European commanders adapted quickly, exploiting gaps, targeting artillery positions, and cutting supply routes. For an empire accustomed to forcing its will upon enemies, this loss of control was devastating. The turning point came when European forces launched a decisive counterattack. Rather than retreating defensively, they pressed forward aggressively, something few armies had dared to do against the Ottomans in the past. Cavalry smashed into Ottoman flanks. Infantry advanced steadily, refusing to panic even under heavy fire. The Ottomans fought fiercely, but their formations began to fracture. Once cohesion was lost, centuries of dominance could not save them. By nightfall, the outcome was undeniable. The Ottoman army withdrew, not in orderly retreat, but in disarray. Equipment was abandoned. Command structure collapsed. What had begun as an attempt to reclaim authority ended as a catastrophic failure. The battlefield did not just mark a military defeat, it symbolized the collapse of an idea. The Ottomans were no longer the inevitable conquerors of Europe. This defeat echoed far beyond the field. Across Europe, news spread rapidly. Kingdoms that had once paid tribute now saw opportunity. Borders hardened. Confidence surged. For the first time in centuries, European states no longer planned around Ottoman expansion. They planned beyond it. The psychological impact was immense. Empires, after all, are sustained as much by belief as by armies, and belief in Ottoman invincibility had been shattered. For the Ottomans, the aftermath was grim. Internal blame games erupted. Commanders were executed or disgraced. Reform was discussed but rarely implemented effectively. Each subsequent campaign revealed the same weakness: an empire struggling to adapt to a changing world. The expansion that had defined Ottoman identity for generations was no longer possible. The frontier had frozen, and with it, the empire's momentum. This battle did not instantly end Ottoman power in Europe, but it ended something far more important: the era of expansion. From this point onward, Ottoman wars would be defensive, reactive, and increasingly desperate. The empire had reached its limits, not because it lacked courage, but because history itself had moved forward without it. In the years that followed, the consequences of this battle became impossible to ignore. The Ottoman Empire, once feared as Europe's greatest threat, now found itself negotiating from a position of weakness. Treaties replaced conquests. Borders were no longer pushed westward. Instead, they were desperately defended. The most symbolic moment came with formal agreements that forced the Ottomans to surrender vast European territories, acknowledging in writing what the battlefield had already proven, that their expansion in Europe was over. This shift marked the beginning of a long decline, not an immediate collapse, but a gradual erosion of power. The Ottomans still ruled vast lands and millions of people, but their role had changed. They were no longer shaping Europe's future, they were reacting to it. Meanwhile, European states accelerated their military and political development. Standing armies became standard, bureaucracies expanded, technology advanced rapidly. The balance of power had permanently shifted. What makes this battle so important is not just who won or lost, but what it represents in human history. It marks the moment when an empire built on continuous conquest reached its natural limit. Expansion had been the engine of Ottoman success. When that engine stopped, the entire system began to weaken. Provinces grew restless. Local rulers asserted independence. Economic strain increased. Without new victories, loyalty became harder to maintain. For Europe, this battle symbolized survival and transformation. It forced long-divided powers to recognize the value of unity. It proved that cooperation could overcome even the most formidable enemy. The fear that had haunted generations slowly faded, replaced by confidence and ambition. Europe no longer defined itself by resistance to Ottoman advance. It began defining itself through expansion of its own, both within the continent and eventually across the world. History often focuses on dramatic endings, the fall of capitals, the execution of rulers, the collapse of regimes, but true turning points are quieter, deeper, and more profound. This battle did not end the Ottoman Empire, but it ended its future in Europe. From this moment on, the empire's story would be one of defense, reform attempts, and gradual retreat rather than unstoppable advance. And that is why this battle matters. It reminds us that no power, no matter how dominant, is immune to change. Empires rise when they adapt, and they fall when they cannot. The Ottomans were once the masters of innovation and organization. When they stopped evolving, history moved past them. On that battlefield, amid smoke and blood, Europe's fate shifted, and the age of Ottoman expansion came to its final end. If you found this story powerful and want more deep, cinematic history like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we continue uncovering the battles that changed the world forever.